28th, 2008, we're in the home of Robert and Ruth Cohen in South Hadley, Massachusetts, to conduct an interview for the Jewish Historical Society of Western Massachusetts. I'd like to begin with Ruth and ask you to tell us something about your family, where they're from.
I was born in Philadelphia. My family, both my mother and father, were born on the Lower East Side. Their parents, my father's parents, came from Hungary, and my mother's parents from Austria. In fact, my Zeta served in the army of the Emperor Franz Joseph.
Can you give names to these people?
My mother's name was Jenny Fried. Well, Jenny Myers was her maiden name, Jenny Fried, and my father was Louis Fried.
Their parents?
And my
grandparents?
My Zeta, who lived with us, was Nathan Myers. He came to live with us when I was born. In fact, I was bilingual before they invented the word because he spoke Yiddish to him. His wife died in the flu epidemic. Clara Myers, her name
1918?
Yes. My father's parents were Sarah and Jacob Fried.
What did your parents do for work, and what did your grandfather do for work?
Well, my grandfather was, he worked in the sweatshops. He was a tailor. He was a hoisin maker.
In the Lower East Side?
Yeah. My mother, when she graduated from high school, in those days she had a librarian's degree, 4 years of high school. But she didn't work as a librarian. She did some office work. Sorry. Dad was an electrician. And he served in the Army in World War I. He was stationed at Penn State. In fact, I have all of his notes, every one of his notes from his courses at Penn State.
Could I say something?
Sure.
A lot has been written about him in Tracy Kidder's book, Old Friends. If you remember that book, there's a lot about Lou Fried in it.
He was one of the main characters in the book. Yeah. He was quite a guy, my dad. He died 11 years ago. I can't believe it's 11 years. Anyway, but then he worked, we lived in Philadelphia, but he worked in Burlington, New Jersey. And he didn't want to move to Burlington because there were no Jewish people there, and he just didn't feel it was right to bring. I had an older brother, to bring the two of us up in Burlington. He worked for a plant that made parts for Parker pens and pencils. My Zeta was a very strong influence in our family. In fact, my brother davened every morning until he went off to college, and then when Zeta wasn't watching, he didn't have to do it anymore. But he went to synagogue every morning, and
Zeta.
And on the way home, he would either stop at the kosher butcher if mother needed meat, or at the baker if she needed bread. And he would come home and have his breakfast and his 1 ounce of brandy. That's all he ever drank for the rest of the day. He only lived to be 98, so you might think about that as a recipe. And then, as I said, when I was a senior in high school, I met Bob. He was a sophomore at Penn. And
how did you meet? At a dance?
We met at a dance. Actually, shall I tell the story?
You were a senior in high school.
I was a senior in high school, yeah.
You shall tell the story.
I was coming back from a house party at Penn State, and I was doing my physics homework on the train. I was a very poor physics student. And there was a gentleman sitting next to me who told me he was a physics instructor at Penn, and he helped me with my homework. He really did. And he invited me to a Sunday afternoon tea dance the following Sunday. what I didn't know was he was the pledge master of Bob's fraternity. And he came back that day and he said, he was engaged to someone. He said, I'm bringing a girl next Sunday to the dance and I want you all to dance with her.
You freshman.
Well, when I got to the dance, I was never so popular in my life. I just couldn't believe it. Everyone kept cutting in on me. It was a dance for Penn freshman girls. I didn't know that either. And this gentleman over here cut in on me, and he said, how do you like Penn? I said, oh, I don't go to Penn. I go to Olney High School. Oh, he said, you must be the one we were told we had to dance with.
Smooth.
Smooth.
That's how we met. Anyway, and then, of course, Bob went into the Army, and I went off to college. And I graduated just shortly after the war was over, and Bob came back. He still had to finish his senior year at Penn.
I want to go back a second. This fraternity was a Jewish fraternity?
Yes.
Yeah.
So everybody at the dance party were Jewish?
Yes.
Yes.
Right. It's not like you lucked on the one Jewish boy.
No.
Right.
No.
They were all Jewish boys.
They were all Jewish boys, yeah. Oh, in those days, I would never have gone out with anyone who wasn't Jewish. I would have thought I'd be zapped by a thunderbolt.
Would anybody have invited you to a non-Jewish?
I don't think so.
No.
I mean, I had a lot of non-Jewish friends in high school, but
not
we
a fraternity.
But we never dated.
Do you have the time here? Well, this was about 1940.
1943.
43.
Yeah.
This is, the war had already started. I was a sophomore at the time, and we met in October. And then you went off to school the next year.
Following September. Yeah.
Why don't we switch to Bob for a little bit? Why don't you back up and tell us about your parents, since your wife has introduced you. Now it's your turn.
My father came to this country, I think, in 1899. I remember him saying he came at 16, and that would be about 1899. My mother, he came from Russia, from a town called Doig. As near as we can spell it, it's D-O-I-G. And once or twice, when I was a youngster, he did go to the old Launcelite used to meet at a get-together, and once or twice I remember they left to go to a Doig party, they used to call it. And I know nothing else about where it was, or at that time everything was Russian. It might have been Latvia, it might have been, they called it Russia. My mother also came from that same area, but she came, she was only about 2 when she got to this country, so she doesn't remember anything about the old country. And
what were their names?
my mother's name was Slotnick.
First name?
First name?
First name was Lena. She had a brother, full brother, and a couple of half brothers. Her full brother, she told me, I don't know if this is true, was the first Jew to be a rep in the State House in Boston. He was a rep from Holyoke. He was a lawyer, young lawyer, worked his way through Yale, and maybe he was the first Jew from Western Mass. I don't know.
What was his name?
His name was Mike Slotnick. He later changed his name to Slater. He still has a family that's in Canada, and big Slater family, but at that time it was Slotnick. I don't know much about my mother's mother and father. I know very, very little, except a year or 2 ago, one of my daughters, maybe come to that later, and I were rummaging through a cemetery here in Chicopee that was the cemetery for the Holyoke Synagogue. And we scrounged, and we finally found a tombstone that we think was my mother's mother. Her name was Rachel Slotnick, married name, and she died in 1923, which would have been the year before I was born. So that's my father, when he came here.
His name?
His name was Lewis Cohen. He came here in about 1899, and he had at that time a brother who had preceded him here. And he also had a sister who...
To this area, Bob? To this area?
Yeah.
To this region?
In New England. My father's brother was living in Gardner, Mass. My father's sister...
What was his name?
His name was Hayman. Hayman, Hayman. My father's sister, I don't know if she preceded him here or came after, but her name, she married an Aliber. She married a fellow from Keene, New Hampshire, by the name of Aaron Aliber. And the Alibers in Keene, and my father and my father's brother, Hayman, they did what most of the immigrants did. They sold, and early on it was by push cart. They had a push cart up where they used to go in and around Keene, New Hampshire, the towns Fitzwilliam, other small towns, Swansea, other towns, and finally the epitome of this was to stop the push carts and establish a store. They finally established a store there
In Keene?
in Keene.
And what was the name of the store?
The name of the store was Vogue, or The Vogue.
And what year about?
I don't know. I would guess it was probably 1910, 1915, into there. One little break, I should say. Before they started, after my father came, and before they started pushcart selling, he worked in a brewery. I remember him telling me that this was the first job he ever had. He worked in a brewery in Boston. He worked 6 days a week, 12 hours a day for the first 5 days. And Saturday he worked just 8 hours a day. And I remember him saying that he would wake up Saturday and feel, I've got only a half a day's work today, because he only had to work from 6 till 6 instead of 6 till 10 or 11. And, that was a kind of a good description of a long day's work.
Ruth wants to say something.
Now, I want to say that he has a cousin in Keene. She's 95 years old, and I guarantee you her memory is sharper than any of the four of us. I mean, she is absolutely incredible.
What's her name?
Her name is Florence Lipsky. She
Her-
was
her
Florence Aliber.
Her maiden name was Florence
If
Aliber.
you want to contact her, she would be a great source of information.
And can you spell Aliber?
Aliber.
Aliber.
That was
And
her
she
maiden
is
name.
the daughter
Lipsky.
of my father's sister. Remember, I mentioned my father had a
Right.
brother Hayman and a sister Ida Aliber. Ida
I'll give you her
Ida.
address and phone number.
Cohen, I guess, who
Cohen,
married Aaron Aliber. Incidentally, I think my father's name in the old country was Katz, because he said when he got to Boston, when he got to this country, he met his brother Hayman, who came here 2 years earlier, and Hayman said, Louis, they're going to ask you your name. Give them a good American name, Cohen. So our name became Cohen after that, but he said it was Katz in the old country.
Well, it's the same thing.
Same name.
It's the same name.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, so this store in Keene kind of spread around. They opened a store in Gardner, and they opened a store in Northampton. They opened a store in Westfield. Westfield store didn't last long.
What were they selling?
Selling clothing, men's clothing, women's clothing, children's clothing. And when not too many years after that, my brother Haman, my uncle Haman, my father's brother, and my father found themselves partners in the two stores, Gardner and Northampton. The Oliver family in Keene kept the Keene store. And my father and his brother amicably split up. My father took the Northampton store, lived in Northampton, and Haman took the Gardner store and lived in Gardner. So my father specialized in women's clothing. At that early on, I think they were selling all kinds of stuff. But when in Northampton, he kept the name Cohen Brothers because he had a couple sons himself. I was one. I had two other brothers.
What are their names?
Bernard and Milton. Milton was older. Bernard was younger. I'll tell you a little about Milton. My father had an early marriage that ended with the death of his wife also in the flu epidemic in 1918. And Milton was a half-brother of mine, actually, a product of that marriage. When my father remarried in 1921, he married this woman from Holyoke. My father was living in Keene at the time, doing the pushcart work. My mother, I had mentioned earlier, came to Holyoke when she was 2 and lived with her family and her mother, who subsequently died, and I don't know anything about her father.
Tell them about your mother.
And an uncle. And my mother went to Mount Holyoke College by trolley from Holyoke. She was the first Jewish woman to graduate from Mount Holyoke. We have that documented from.
They have it
from
in
Mount
the
Holyoke.
archives.
Yeah, and so here's this widower up in Keene who heard of this single woman in Holyoke.
School teacher.
They what?
School teacher.
A school teacher.
She taught math and German at Holyoke High School.
She graduated she used to call it '08. She graduated in 1908 from Mount Holyoke and taught at Holyoke High from '08 until 1920 or 21 when they were married. And she went up to Keene with him and detested it. She hated Keene. And so my father was a good husband. He came to Northampton. That's when they started the store in Northampton. But Haman was still a partner of his at first. It was Cohen Brothers, and then I don't know when the partnership dissolved and it became my father's. But they lived in Northampton from 1921 when they were married until they died.
Where in Northampton did they live?
They started. They first lived on a house that's right opposite the current synagogue on Prospect Street. It's
The little one?
it's a small one. It's got a stucco bottom. It's about the third house from Franklin Street corner. And I don't know how long they lived there, but I think they rented that house, and it couldn't have been very long because I was born in 1924, just 3 or 4 years after they were married. My older sister was born a year after they were married. But they were already living on a house they bought at 64 Belmont Avenue, which is right next to the Smith campus on the corner of West Street and Belmont Avenue, where I lived for the first 14 years of my life. And when I was 14 in 1938, they bought 111 South Street, where
Lou Smith's daughter lives. Sally Smith's daughter. What's her name?
I forget her name.
She sings in the...
She married a faculty member.
Yeah, the French guy. The guy teaches French.
Oh,
Yes.
Esterbouzy.
Esther
Yes,
Boozy.
yes,
right, I
yes.
couldn't
That
think of her
the house.
They live in
Yeah.
that house, lovely house.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a nice
that's
house.
where-
And when we moved in there was in 1938. It was a big improvement over 64 Columbus Avenue.
Belmont.
And we
Belmont.
lived there until we were married. In fact, after we were married, while we were building a house, we lived there for half a year or so.
Were there certain neighborhoods that Jewish people lived in and certain neighborhoods they couldn't live in? How did they happen to pick certain places to live?
Well, there was a Jewish neighborhood, but it preceded me. By the time I was aware of what's going on, that was already coming apart. But there were Jews off of Market Street, off of Bridge
synagogue.
Street. Budger was a
Near
name.
the synagogue,
Near
in other
the old
words.
synagogue,
Where the old
sure.
synagogue was,
Right.
yes.
So they could walk.
Yeah. Budger was one, Carlson, the old man Carlson.
And also the street now where the new senior center is.
A lot of
the
August
August
lived,
lived there.
Con Street.
Con Street,
Yeah.
yes.
Was that the name of it then?
No, it wasn't. It was called Maple Street.
And they had their cattle there?
And they had, yes, there was a
Yeah.
cattle there.
Can you remember that?
Yes, I remember. I tell you what I remember. My father and his buddies. It was Lou Berger and M.L. August and others used to play pinochle every Sunday morning, and I don't know why, but they played in the barn, down at the cattle barn. Could it be that
Maybe he
my
had
mother
a-
didn't want card playing in the house? I don't know. I mean, they all had nice houses, and they could have played. They could have switched the game from one house to the other.
This was a family tradition.
It
This
was
is where we play card games.
Yes, it was. It was a tradition. They played cards.
So where was the house on Con Street? In terms of what's there now?
Senior center, you think?
It was pretty. It was either at or very near where that new senior center.
On the
is.
same side of the street?
Yeah.
Same side of the street. I think it was right there. It was at that
We talked.
Can I go back to the 16, was it? Belmont Street?
Belmont Avenue.
Belmont Avenue. Was that one of the houses they just tore down for Smith's
No,
Science
it's
Center?
still there. It's a two-family house. It's very close to the area that's torn down.
It's across the street?
No, it's on,
On
the
the same
corner
side.
of,
Where
it's
High
on the
Lives
corner of West.
High lives near
Well,
there.
High
and
lives on
Belmont.
a log
Yeah.
in the next street.
You know, Belmont, when you come from Green Street, there's a sharp crook in it after Awaga Avenue. And then it goes down to West Street. This is on the corner of West and Belmont, so it's not up in the Smith area. It's 2 or 3 houses removed from it.
So was that a Jewish neighborhood?
No,
No.
there were about 100 Jewish families.
What year are we talking?
I was born in 1924. My memory of Northampton goes back through the 30s. I was a teenager and grammar school and high school in the 30s. Graduated high school in 1941. In the 30s, there were about 100 Jewish families, and it stayed that way for many years. There were plus or minus just a few, 98, 101, 102, up until the 60s, about the time when Rabbi Langenauer, now Asher Barzev, moved, and then there was a big expansion of the Jewish population. But going back to the 30s, there was no Jewish neighborhood. The Jews were all spread around, and I say 100 families. 100 families sounds like a lot, but there were very few. It didn't seem to me like there were 100 families. There were very few in school.
That's what I was going to ask you. How many Jewish kids do you remember around you in high school, say?
When I was in high school, each class had 2 or 3. So maybe there were 8 or 10 Jewish kids in the high school. And the same thing was true growing up. And I, for one, felt I felt Jewish and was made to feel Jewish. I was taunted and called a Jew by a few kids, maybe not a lot, but enough so that I felt
Did you?
I certainly felt the difference.
Some of the other interviews we've had have noted that, and can you pinpoint what group of kids were more likely to be taunting you, and what kind of words they might be using?
Well, Jew, dirty Jew.
But in English.
In English.
So
Maybe Yid, I don't know. And I don't know. I can't pinpoint who it was. It
wasn't children of immigrants from
It
Europe.
wasn't. No. Some might have been, but I don't think all were. I remember one who wasn't had a good Yankee name, and I remember another who had a Polish name. So no, I don't think it was any one.
How were the teachers in terms of that?
Teachers were, for the most part, good, but not all. I do remember being tormented in 8th grade by an English teacher who was teaching Merchant of Venice. And she would cackle whenever she came to Shylock. And whenever we read parts aloud in class, Bob, you'll be Shylock. And I was the only Jew in that particular class.
Do you remember her name?
I don't know. I must have pushed it out of my.
But you were conscious of what she was doing.
Yeah. Oh yes. And I remember.
And so was everybody else.
Yes. And I remember being so relieved when we were finished Merchant of Venice. But jumping ahead for more than 50 years, I'll tell you a little story about my 50th high school reunion, which was in 1991. I graduated high school in 1941. And in 1991, at the 50th, it was a big reunion, obviously. That's a big time. And I saw a lot of people from high school that I hadn't seen in a long time. Some of them probably for the whole 50 years, because the war came right after. I graduated in 41. War started right after we graduated, and people spread all over the country, and we never saw each other. So I think maybe it was for the first time. And we were talking, I was talking with old friends, and we were reminiscing. And they, for the most part, they were jovial, and they recall their high school years fondly. And I said something like, that's funny, I don't remember those years favorably at all. I said, in fact, I was glad they were finished. And one of them said to me, is that because you were Jewish? And
she was aware. Yeah.
And none of these people were Jewish,
Yeah.
but she knew right away that she and others were. I mean, I was friendly with them all on the surface, but never really friendly, and never. I was on the periphery of all of it. We were in the same class all the time, but I was on the periphery of friendship with these people.
There was a barrier that existed.
Pardon me?
There was a road you couldn't cross. There was a barrier.
Exactly.
There was a barrier.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and I probably didn't verbalize it as such at the time, but that's exactly what it was. And she knew it. That I was surprised. I mean, I didn't venture to say that, and I probably didn't realize to myself that's why I wasn't awfully happy in high school, because you take high school, everything comes a day at a time. You don't wake up, oh, I'm unhappy because I'm Jewish. It's part of growing up, but she put it the way I should have put it. It's because I was Jewish.
Do you remember some of your Jewish friends in elementary school, junior high school,
Yes,
high school?
yeah.
Can you tell us their names and what they did and what became of them?
Okay, I can. One of them was Rita August, who just died recently, Rita Fogel. She was a year behind me in school. Another was Shirley Raymond, whose father was Adolph Raymond, who owned a dry cleaning business in town.
Twin cleaners.
Twin cleaners. They had a couple of kids. One was few years older than I was, but one was in my class. Her name was Shirley Raymond. I think she eventually lived in Pittsfield and married somebody from Pittsfield and lived there. I lost touch with her. There was a fellow named Bill Zack who lived in town for just 2 years and moved away. There was another fellow who I think came from Springfield, name of Oshansky, Herbert Oshansky, lived in town for a few years and then moved away. But these were in the early years. Later on in junior high and high school, we had a little club. There were 6 or 8 or 10 of us, enough to have a club that I think we called it Let's Be Friendly Club or Happy Go Lucky, HGO, Happy Go Lucky. Rita August, one of the Allen girls by the name of Iva Allen. I think Iva was, I don't know all the relationships, but I think she was Jimmy Allen's sister maybe, or...
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you know the Allen brothers who played basketball? High school?
Was one, oh, Myron Allen was one. Was he Myron?
What's the gentleman we interviewed?
No, I know.
Elliot.
Elliot Allen, his brother. It must be Myron.
I think that was before.
They were champs. They became champs, I think.
That was before my time because my older brother Milton knew them, and I remember him talking about that. That was probably in the early 30s, late 20s. Yeah.
You were telling us some more names of friends of yours in high school from this club.
Yes. Let's see. I had. I'm trying to think of my Cheder class. It was Myron Allen. He was Jimmy's younger brother by just a few years. There were only a couple of us. Myron. I don't remember.
Tell us about your Cheder class. Where did you study, and who were your teachers?
The teacher was a man by the name of Schneider. I don't remember his first name, but his brother was the fellow in Springfield who used to have a deli, had a Schneider's.
Oh, Jake Schneider.
Jake Schneider's kosher delicatessen in Springfield.
Do you remember where that was?
Oh yes, it was on Ferry Street,
railroad station.
which was the next block from the railroad station, which was all leveled during urban renewal.
Did the people from Northampton go to Ferry Street a lot?
Oh yes.
Yes, that's the only place you could. There was no kosher anything in Northampton. My mother and her friend used to go down there every week, and
in fact, let me interrupt and tell you a story. Shortly after we were married, my mother-in-law sent us to go shopping at Jake Schneider's. My father-in-law only liked corned beef with fat in it. It had to have fat.
Anything fat too. He liked fat chicken.
So we were in Jake Schneider's, and I ordered the corned beef, and he was slicing it. I said, is that corned beef fat? And he said, no, it's lean. Oh, I said, then I don't want it. And he looked up, he said, oh, you must be Louis Cohen's new daughter-in-law. Don't worry, it's plenty fat enough.
Early, when I
knew I was Louis Cohen's new daughter-in-law.
So when you and your mother used to go shopping? No, your mother used to go shopping.
No, my mother-in-law.
Mother-in-law. So
my mother.
She never took you.
No, my mother-in-law sent the two of us.
Actually, we went to pick somebody up at the train station.
Yeah,
I think.
And she gave us a little shopping list.
So can you remember the street? Tell us what you remember of Ferry Street.
Well,
All I remember
I'll
is
tell you
Jake Schneider. Bob will tell you.
Ferry Street had on it several Jewish stores. One was a delicatessen called Goss's. It was an eat-in delicatessen, and I remember their sign, Epis Essen, Goss's Delicatessen. And I remember the sign because I asked my mother, what does that mean? Epis Essen, something to eat. And there was a fish
Gossin
market.
was spelled how?
Pardon me?
How do you spell Gosson?
G-O-S-S, and it had an apostrophe, so it's G-O-S-S apostrophe S. Essen, Gosses, Delicatessen. I don't know how long it was there. There was a fish market that used to, the floor was sawdust and it reeked of fish. I don't remember the name. And there was a nice bakery there. We always thought of it as a Jewish bakery, but I don't know if it was a Jewish bakery. Daum's, D-A-U-M apostrophe S. And they had dark rye and nice, good rye bread. And maybe it must have been a Jewish bakery, because it was on Ferry Street, where all these Jewish stores were. There may have been another one or two meat markets. I think there were. I don't remember the names.
Mm-hmm. And the atmosphere on that street, what did it feel like?
It was narrow and dark, and it was sort of old world, and I was very young at the time. I don't recall.
It may have been like the Lower East Side, in a sense.
I think yes, it was. I
so
think
they had
it was.
repeated it.
Yes, yeah. I think that would be a good description of it.
Did you have any contact growing up with the Jews of Springfield or Holyoke or Greenfield, or were you all separate communities?
Separate communities, and I often thought of that we were nearby, but very almost no contact, and I don't think my parents had friends in other communities either. My mother should have. She was born and brought up in Holyoke, and she's living 8 miles away. She knew people in Holyoke, but saw them rarely.
That brings me to a question I had earlier. How did your father hear about your mother in Holyoke? I mean, here that's quite a distance. What was the connection?
Ruth has an idea. We've heard.
Your cousin Florence told me.
Okay.
And this is the one who lives in Keene. There was a whole network up and down the valley. Everybody knew.
Well, there still
is. There was
this
single woman in Holyoke, and here was this widower who needed somebody to take care of his little boy.
And she was, as I calculated, probably about 32 at the time.
Just about, yes. Yeah.
Right, so this was really a single woman.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right, in those days, right?
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
And my father was 5 years older, so he must have been about 38. And I remember my upbringing is that they were old as parents go. They weren't. I didn't have a close, friendly relationship with them. My father worked hard. He was old, and he wasn't particularly a demonstrative kind of a guy. I'm sure he was loving and a very good parent, but my mother would say, "Go kiss your father good night," and he'd be reading the paper, and I'd crawl up on his lap and give him a kiss good night, and barely got an acknowledgement from him. But he was a good father, good parent. But he was older, and
How old was your brother Milton when your mother came into the
Milton was 10 years older than I was, and he was born in 1914. My mother came into the picture in 1920.
About 6 or
or
7.
21. He must have been 6 or so. And I've asked my cousin Florence about this. My cousin Florence in Keene. Remember, I told you my folks lived there for 6 months after they were married, and she remembers. She was probably she was 14 or 15 at the time. She remembers taking little Milton around and taking him shopping, and she remembers quite well.
Does Milton ever tell you that he has memories of his mother?
Well, Milton's been gone for several years now.
He
never talked about his mother.
He didn't. But Florence once said she was a very pretty.
Yeah, she was beautiful.
Pretty woman, and I think we saw a picture once somewhere. Yeah.
So let's go back to the Cheder. You were telling us
Yeah.
about your studies with Mr.
Yeah.
Schneider.
Yeah.
What was it like? Were you learning Hebrew? Were you just
We
learning
were
prayers?
learning how to read Hebrew. No translation at all.
Just the words.
Just the words, and for the most part, we went over and over the same thing so much that we pretty much knew it almost by memory. And the blessing after the Haftorah and before the Haftorah, over and over and over and over. So his whole objective was that when we got on the bima, when we were bar mitzvah, that we performed adequately. So it was just, and first of all, he was an old world guy. He didn't speak English very well, and he didn't dress very well. And we were in the melting pot, and we kind of resented this. There were probably 4 or 5 of us. I don't remember who they all were now.
Were you expected on your bar mitzvah to also read from Torah?
Yes.
You were taught
and
how
we
to
did.
And have Torah?
Yeah, and we did.
Okay. So he's the one who taught you that
Yes.
as well?
Yes. And he, but we went for probably 4 years. I think we started in, I don't know, probably at 8 or 9 years old, and we went, I don't know how often, but probably 2 or 3 times a week. And it was in the old synagogue, and it was kind of cold, as I recall. They didn't heat the place up. There was something I wanted to say.
Can you recall what the old synagogue looked like inside?
Yes.
I'm sure I can.
Yeah.
What did it look like?
Yeah. There were 2 entrances. The main synagogue that you would enter on the high holidays was in front. The other end, the entrance that was almost always used was not that one. It was on the side, and there was a long corridor away from the street, and you entered into the big social hall, which was the everything hall. It was the Sunday school and the Hebrew school and the gathering hall, and if they ever had a
Hadassah meeting hall.
Hadassah meeting, and if they ever had a dinner or a supper, it was there. It was an everything hall, and it was old and unappetizing, especially for a kid.
Who were the rabbis when you started out there?
Well, when I started out, our teacher, Schneider, we used to call him Rabbi Schneider. He wasn't a rabbi; he was a teacher, a malamed. There was no rabbi, but about 6 months just before I was bar mitzvah, we got a rabbi who I think was the first rabbi. His name was Fishman, and he stayed in Northampton for a year or 2. He was young, and he actually officiated at my bar mitzvah. He was my teacher maybe for several months before my bar mitzvah, but I do remember him quite fondly because he was a little more modern than, I was still young, I was 12. He was a little more modern than Schneider.
I'm looking at a picture of the current B'nai Israel synagogue. There are 2 fancy chairs up on the bima. I suspect that those came from the old synagogue.
I think they did, yes. Yes.
Do you remember any other items that came from the old synagogue?
The pews are from the old synagogue. Those wooden, they're still there.
There's a round window that's not in this picture that is now over the bima. Did that come from a stained glass window?
I think that did. I think so.
I also noticed in the new synagogue that they don't have the bima is the reading table is not up there.
In that picture?
Yes.
In the new synagogue.
In the new synagogue. Do you know if that was done for the picture, or that they had, or did they read from Torah down in the congregation?
No,
I
they
don't
know. There was always a reading table there. I don't know why it's not in the picture.
Yeah, I don't know why. I wonder if that picture was taken before
It was actually open.
before it was
While it
completed.
was being constructed.
Because
maybe.
it's always been there that I remember.
Yeah.
Do you recall when they read Torah? Did they read the whole portion? Everything?
When I was a kid,
Yeah.
I think so.
Was it an Orthodox service?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Were the women separated from the men?
Yes. Upstairs.
There was
Stairs.
a balcony upstairs?
Balcony upstairs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the women were separated.
At what point did that change?
I think when the new synagogue
No,
was,
it before.
was it before?
Yeah, it was before.
While they were still at that
Yeah, while
structure?
it was still in the
I don't
old-
remember.
The women began to sit in the back.
Right.
No, I think I heard that the balcony was condemned.
Yeah, I think so.
Oh,
yeah.
that could be. That could be. So it was sort of enforced
Yeah.
togetherness.
Do you recall the kinds of melodies that were sung? Would you say it was a German sound? You know, I'm talking about like the Nigun from the service.
I couldn't tell.
I don't know what you mean by German.
Well, there's certain Ashkenaz kind of sounds to the songs. Adon Olam, you know, the melodies.
No, it
Was it foreign to you
traditional.
coming
I
from
don't
Philadelphia?
know. At first, now going to services, I find a lot of it is foreign to me.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Because they're not traditional.
They're not
It's
traditional.
Adon Olam, Asher Malach.
See,
They don't.
we never
don't do
did that.
that.
It
But
was
when you came up from-
Olam, Asher Molach.
That's new. First, I want to. There's something I still didn't say about growing up. You asked about what it was like being Jewish growing up. Besides being taunted and being called a Jew, I always remember my folks saying, "Well, you can't study engineering. A Jew can't be an engineer." I never bothered to ask why. And a Jew can't be a doctor. You can't be. I was a good student in school, and I could have aspired at least to something like that. No,
Well, Jews couldn't get into medical school.
you'll go into the store. It's a best
They'll
thing
sell
to do.
dresses.
Yeah. So when I got time to go to college, I was my mother. You know about. My father was not keen on college either spending the money or the time to study in college. But when I discovered the University of Pennsylvania had the Wharton School and he could justify it to himself, oh, it's a business school, this was fine. So I went to Penn sort of with his blessing, but with the idea that I would come back into the store.
What was your notion of what you'd be doing?
My notion was to go to law school, and I had even applied to law school. I was
He was a
thinking
top
I might,
student.
but my father about that time got sick. Well, let me go back a little bit. I haven't mentioned the war. I was in Europe during the war.
Where were you in Europe?
I was in Belgium, France, Germany.
Battle of the Bulge.
Battle of the Bulge in an infantry division. And about this time, my father was sick. I was back home. He was sick. And he said he needed me in the business when I graduated from college. So this is in 44 and 45. So when I came back, I did go into the business with him and my sister and brother. And didn't particularly like it, but I stuck it out for 19 years, and then
19 years?
19 years until the late 60s, mid 60s. I just up and left. Our kids were in college, and I just up and left, and I went back to school, and I went to Smith and UMass, and I got a degree in mathematics, and that's when I started to teach math after that. So.
Where did you teach math then?
At Greenfield Community College.
What was it like those 19... Can you describe the store for us? The Cohen Brothers store, exactly what it looked like?
Yes.
Do you have pictures of it by chance?
I don't have any pictures,
Okay, what did it look like? You come in the store.
Okay.
Where was it? 33 Main
The store
Street?
was 33 Main Street, which is at the lower end of Main Street.
What's there now?
is a Goodwill shop, not a Goodwill. It's
I don't know.
a
There's something there now. But
Oh,
then
the
they-
hospice shop?
no.
No.
Main
It's,
Street.
it's a religious.
I don't know. And then
It's
they
a-
moved up.
It's the last. There are two blocks in Lower Main Street. There's the Masonic block, and then there's a block that Raymond had a real
Insurance,
estate office
yeah.
in.
Yeah.
We were the last building in the Raymond block. Next to, we weren't
Oh,
in the
Smith
Masonic.
Charities.
Pardon me?
Next to Smith Charities.
You mean that side? Or?
Next to Smith Charities is that block.
Yeah.
And we were the last store down toward the underpass.
Oh, toward the train, you say?
Oh, Fitzwillie?
We were the last store in the. There are two blocks, and we were the last store in the first block. The last block is the
Means
one
two
that's
sections,
That's
actually.
Fitzwillie's.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
And we were the actually it's the third and last store. The first one was when we were there was a bakery called Federal Bake Shop or something, but that became the Raymond real estate office. Next to that was for many years the Fines Army and Navy store, and then 33 Main. That's where we were, and we always felt out of a poor location. We always felt, if we only could be in the middle of Main Street. Now, of course, the whole, even Pleasant Street and Lower Main Street are busy, but in those days, most of the business was up near where McCallum's was, where Thorns is now. A smaller town, and so we were kind of out of the Main Street. It was a store that was kind of old-fashioned, but my father did it over in about 1933, but kind of superficially. There was kind of a modern Art Deco kind of top of the dress bin, so it looked decent, presentable, but nothing great. It's low down there, and 2 or 3 times he had severe flooding. It was a 2-story store. He had stuff in the basement, children's department in the basement, and it used to flood twice. Water got under the underpass on Main Street, and water seeks its own level, so all the stores down there. I remember one of the severe floods. It came almost to the top of the basement, and you could look down the stairs and see mannequins floating in the water. Look, it was disastrous. But that's when I was a kid. That's before I worked.
There was a big flood in this area in 1937?
38.
38.
There was also
Has the picture.
Also, it's kind of forgotten now. There was a flood almost as big in 36, but the 38 flood superseded that. That 38 flood is the story I wanted to tell you about with my camera. I love to take pictures, and I had a dark room in the cellar
Of the house.
And in 1938,
How would you develop the film?
In the dark room.
What was the method?
I developed the film in the old-fashioned method with a tank. There were 3 tanks. There was a developer and a hypo and a washing solution and a dark room light, a very light, very dull red light that didn't impede the film, and it's the only light in the room. And by hand, you had to do this for 4 minutes, hold the film up, but that was the way it was done. In fact, toward the end of that hobby, the tank method came along, where you'd spool a film in a tank, and you could even develop it with a light on, and that was a big deal. But anyway, getting back to the pictures, I had hundreds and hundreds of pictures of the flood of 1938. which today would be priceless. And I took them all over town of homes that were flooded. There was a hurricane along with that. Trees that were down. Desolation everywhere. And I had hundreds and hundreds of these pictures, not very well cataloged. They must have been in boxes, and they must have been in my folks' way. And during the war, when I wasn't home, 1944, it was only 6 years. These weren't old enough to be valuable. They weren't old enough to have any.
Historic importance.
They were just new enough to be a nuisance. And anyway, when I came back from service, none of that stuff was around anywhere. It was gone.
Wow.
And
Setting up a dark room, was that an expensive proposition?
No, well, it could have been, but I used what was at one time an old coal bin. It was a section of the cellar that was sectioned off. I used to keep coal in there, and I blocked off whatever light sources were still around. There was cracks in the wood, but essentially it was a little separate room, and just blocking off a few cracks, I was able to make a little room. It was damp, you know.
Did you have a sink?
Pardon me?
Did you have a sink?
I didn't have. There was a sink in the basement, but not in the dark room. I would carry water back and forth. There was a what do you call it? The kind of sinks that you'd wash clothes in the cellar.
So let's go on now again, talking about your military experience.
Yeah.
You were in the infantry.
Yeah.
Okay. While you were in the service, were you very conscious of being Jewish?
Yes.
Can you give us reasons for that?
Well, okay. I guess my consciousness was the same as I had before. Oh, and I'm going to backtrack for a minute. When I got to Penn first, this is before I was in the service, I graduated high school in 1941, and I got to Penn in fall of 41. This is a couple of months before Pearl Harbor. To discover that Penn was a big fraternity school. Almost everybody lived in a fraternity. There were very, very few places to live outside of fraternities. So I'm going to join a fraternity. There were 43 fraternities at Penn at the time. 11 of them were Jewish, and 20, the balance were Gentile. The Jewish fraternities were called Group B fraternities. The Gentile fraternities were Group A fraternities. And without saying that they were Jewish fraternities, we got a little letter. You can only, during rushing, you can apply to the Group B fraternities. We all knew what they were talking about, but nothing was said. Group B fraternities. The Group B fraternities had their own interfraternity council, own interfraternity ball. When there was very little friendship back and forth, but there were some. And whenever I went to a Group A fraternity, I couldn't go in. I could go to the house and ask them to get John Smith. And John Smith would come down, and remember...
Did the same thing apply in reverse?
I don't think anybody ever came to our house to inquire. I really don't.
So there were obviously no blacks and Asians. Those would be Group C.
That's right.
Probably.
Right, correct.
But 11 out of 43 seems a lot to me.
Yes. It wasn't...
There were a lot of Jewish people.
We never felt... like I did in Northampton, where not only a minority, but a tiny, tiny minority. I think you feel a little more comfortable with when you're in a big minority. You have maybe misery loves company or something like that.
So you took an aside. So you were telling us about the military and your being Jewish.
Yes. Okay. So when I got into the military, I already had some of this sense of Jews not being too welcome. But and I had very few counterparts in the service. The places I went, the company I was in, and the places I went in the service didn't happen to have many. There were plenty of Jews in the service, but very few, almost non-existent in the companies I was in. I was in a training camp in Alabama for 3 months. 1 or 2 Jews. Incidentally, one of them is a Northampton resident, Stanley Elkins. Do you know Stanley?
Of course.
Okay.
He was there also?
Not only was he there, he and I were the very first day we were in the Army, put into this place in Fort McClellan, and I knew he was Jewish. That's about all. He knew I was Jewish. What we didn't know that is my father did business with his father. His father manufactured dresses or skirts or something, and he was selling, came into Northampton, he was selling stuff to my father, and they got talking. Your son's in the Army. My son said, "Where's your son?" "Oh, he's in Alabama." "Oh, Alabama, my father." Anyway, Fort McClellan. Same street, same address. We lived in the same bunk. This was just coincidental. And finally, I got a letter one day from my father. He got a letter from his father, and so we discovered our fathers knew each other. And when that was in basic training, it was a tough basic training. And after it was over, we went separate ways in the Army. And several years after that, we were living in Northampton, and in a conversation, somebody said, "There's a new Jewish professor at Smith College, Stanley Elkins." I said, Stanley Elkins. So I called him, and just out of the blue, I said, "Stanley, are you the Stanley Elkins that I happen to know?" And, "Oh, yes." So it's funny. I mean, since then we've been friends in Northampton, but that was very coincidental. But anyway, there weren't too many Stanley Elkins, and I went from there to a couple other places in the Army. And I finally wound up in the 106th Infantry Division. There weren't many Jews in it either. And
Did you find yourself either self-appointed or appointed by others as the representative of the Jewish people?
I kind of felt that way, but nothing official. The Jews were non-existent as far as what I kind of felt personally, and probably, and I don't know if this is true or not, but I was a buck private for a long time in the Army, and I kind of said to myself, it's probably because I'm Jewish, because if you're in the Army after basic training, you get a PFC even or something, a little promotion. But I was a buck private through training, advanced training. I was in a engineering outfit for a couple months, studying engineering in the Army before I went into the 106th Division, and I got into the 106th. We trained, went overseas. I'm still a buck private, and during our combat, suddenly one day I see I'm a PFC. Ruth always says I got a frontline promotion from private to PFC. But they probably said, "Hey, this guy's here and he's still a buck private. We have to make him a PFC."
We're talking about Stanley Elkins, also remaining a buck private for a long time.
I think he was buck private, and if it wasn't a buck private, he might have been a PFC. But I do remember some stories of his that he had 150 prisoners that he was taking from point A to point B, and somebody said, "Hey, look at this private. He's got all these." He probably should have been. I don't know what he did wind up at, but from stories that we've told each other, I think his rank also wasn't very high.
Did you go through Germany with the infantry?
Yes, yeah.
Did you go through any concentration camps?
No, I never.
Did you know about them once you were in Germany?
I never got away from the eastern part of Germany. The western part, the around the Rhine. I was up and down the Rhine a lot, but never, the concentration camps were all in the other end of the...
But did you hear about them? Eisenhower?
Yes, we heard about them right away. You know, it was in the
Stars and Stripes, or
Stars and Stripes, sure. I mean, we were current. There was a European edition of the Herald
Tribune.
Herald Tribune?
Herald Tribune. You know, after the war, we had access to all of this right away. During the war, Stars and Stripes was probably our only access to news. But yeah, we heard about that. There was one fellow in our outfit who knew a little bit of Yiddish, and in Germany he was kind of an unofficial translator, because he although he didn't know an awful lot, he knew more than most anybody else in the outfit. And in France, I still remembered my high school French. I used to do that in our outfit in France. I could.
So this means that you didn't know Yiddish.
Correct.
So your parents spoke Yiddish to each other, but the kids, by the time you were growing up, Yiddish was
I
not...
think it's the grandparents. Was it
Your
your grandparents
parents
who
didn't
spoke
speak
Yiddish?
My parents spoke Yiddish, but they only spoke Yiddish when they didn't want us to understand what they were.
Oh, you
saying.
spoke Yiddish growing up.
Yeah, Ruth
right?
spoke Yiddish.
Ah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I wanted to go back a little bit about observance, because we never touched upon that. If we go from grandparents to parents to your generation, to your children's generation, to your grandchildren's generation, can you just sort of highlight the levels of observance that was common in the family during the year?
Sure. I have to preface that with saying that I never had a grandparent. All
Okay.
four of my grandparents were dead by the time I was born.
But you might have heard about it.
Little
Okay.
or nothing.
Okay.
I don't know.
So,
But my father was an immigrant. My mother, I mean, he came here at 16. My mother came here at 2. And they were observant in the sense that they reminded themselves constantly that they were Jewish, but they weren't observant enough to go to services,
light candles,
light candles. They didn't light candles.
kept kosher.
Didn't keep kosher, but didn't have any pork in the house.
Mm-hmm.
And
Would they have eaten non-kosher meats?
yes,
like
non-kosher meats.
Outside?
Yes, and inside too. Didn't keep a kosher home.
Was that unusual, you think, in Northampton?
I think maybe half and half.
Well, some of our interviewees have said that the observance, the non-observance of Shabbat, really came out of having to open their shops on Saturday for economic reasons.
That could be. That could be. You know, you can't go back and see what would it like have been if they weren't storekeepers. So
Right.
I don't know, but
Even
that
Leonard Alberts worked on Saturday.
No,
Right.
Yeah, no, Leonard Alberts was very observant, but that's the one thing he went to work on Saturday.
So when you two got together, did you have different levels of observance that you were accustomed to? And if you did, how did you accommodate each other, and how did you decide how to raise your children?
So, Ruth, what did you grow up with?
I grew up in a very traditional home. As I said, my grandfather lived with us. My mother kept a strictly kosher home.
She lit candles?
Oh yes, in fact I have a picture on my refrigerator of her. Yeah, every Friday night she lit the candles. And did the women go to shul? she hardly ever went to shul. When I was a little girl, my Zayda would take me to shul with him. And I was allowed to sit with him until one day there was a man in front of us who was davening very, very physically. Vigorously. And I turned to him and in a stentorian voice and said, "Zeta, I think he has to go to the bathroom." And Zeta said, "Schweig still," and that was the last time I was allowed to sit with him on Saturday morning. But that was fine because I could sit with my friends, which was what I really wanted to do. We observed, everything was observed. I can still remember bringing the dishes up from the cellar at Pesach and taking them back the week later. And our Seders never skipped a word. Zeta conducted the Seder.
Were they fun?
Not when I was little, no.
When did they become fun?
I don't think they ever really became fun. They became very tedious. Yeah.
So you were prepared to drop some of this. So when the two of you were together...
Yeah.
How did you accommodate each other? What did you decide?
We always have a little Seder, but certainly nothing compared to time-wise.
But we never kept a kosher home, and I don't think it bothered you, did it?
No, I don't have any pork products, but...
Okay, how about
do you
doing
still
Shabbat?
not? Wait a second. Do you still not cook meat and milk dishes together?
We don't have separate dishes.
No. I meant
Dishes.
if you have a recipe that's like that requires some mixing. Is that part of your consciousness?
No.
No, it doesn't bother you. Right?
No.
Okay.
And when you had your children, did you observe Friday night? Did you do Shabbat with them? What kind of...
No, not really.
Carol remembers being a member of CBI as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
So she
All
went to
three of
Hebrew
us.
school?
All three of our kids did.
Girls
The
didn't
girls
go to
weren't
Hebrew
bat
school.
mitzvah in those days.
Girls didn't go to Hebrew school when she was a kid. In fact, she
was bat mitzvah a few years ago.
She was bar mitzvah just a few years ago in Greenfield, along with a group of girls, her contemporaries, who also didn't go to Hebrew. But they did have a Sunday school.
And they were confirmed.
They went to Sunday
They
school
went to
every
Sunday
Sunday.
school.
So even when you had your children, you didn't go to shul on Saturday?
Not regularly, no.
Not regularly.
Although I have to say that once, he was Arthur Langenauer at first. When he came, there was almost kind of a renaissance. And I enjoyed going to services again because they were so much more like what I had been raised
Can you
up
be
as.
more specific? What was going on? Was it the service? Was it his sermons? What was it?
It was everything. It was everything. It was a traditional service, but he just made things a lot more meaningful to me. And not just to me, but to a lot of other people.
Well, we used to go Friday night quite often. No, we didn't go Saturday, but we
We would
went,
often go Friday
often
night.
went Friday night.
But before he came, we were talking about Masonic Street before. Leonard was the president of the synagogue at the time, or the principal of the Sunday school.
Oh.
We ran a Sunday school there.
Oh, we're talking. This is in between.
Yeah, the old shul and the new shul, and we were all volunteer teachers. Bob was one. I was one. Judy Raymond was one.
And
there were several.
And before Masonic Street, I think we were between the synagogues for 2 years or 3 years.
Yeah.
The first year, the synagogue hired a hall in the Masonic building. This is not Masonic Street. This is the building that Fitzwillies is in. And we hired a...
and then we were at the People's Institute for a while.
Yes, that's the one I thought you called Masonic Street, which is Center Street.
Yeah.
After the first year, it was on the People's Institute on Center Street. Center Street?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Gothic Street.
Gothic.
Gothic Street. People's Institute on Gothic Street. That's when Leonard was...
And I have one wonderful memory. Leonard, it was Hanukkah, and we had an assembly, and Leonard was explaining exactly what Hanukkah was, and
And what it wasn't.
And what it wasn't.
It wasn't.
Exactly. And he emphasized what it wasn't. And on the way out, all the kids were on their way out, and Bruce Fogel, believe it or not, a little kid at the time, walked past Leonard and he said, "Merry Christmas, teacher."
He was saying, "This is not our Christmas."
I'll never forget the look on Leonard's face.
Yeah.
Cracked us up. Anyway, but we did that for a couple of years.
And when the new synagogue went up, that book that you have is the dedication of the, apparently.
Yeah.
I had forgotten.
And how old were you at this point? You were in your
I was 39.
So you were one of the young families.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you get involved in some of the activities at the synagogue?
Oh, yes.
Can you give us some examples
Yeah.
of what the women's role, so to speak, was in the synagogue?
Yes, I was very active in the sisterhood. In fact, Bernice Alberts and I, and Judy Raymond too, we wrote several musicals, and they were performed and
Well attended.
well attended. We made a lot of money on them. Yeah, we wrote all the words, and Judy Sharp played the piano, and I was very active in the sisterhood and in Hadassah. And in fact, just an interesting story, my kids were starting to grow up. Marcy was, my youngest one, was then 5 years old. And I was thinking, she's going to start school and they're going to want me to work in the store. And there was nothing that I wanted to do less than work in the store. And I had never, as an undergraduate, I had never taken any education courses. But somebody told me, you need 18 credits to teach in Massachusetts. Well, this was in the summer, and we were having a Hadassah meeting, officers meeting at Sarah Allen's house. And I had just been elected vice president of Hadassah. Now, vice president is one person, I guess, who is supposed to be in charge of fundraising. You don't remember Lillian August. She was before your time. Well, Lillian August was a very outspoken woman. And she said, Ruth Cohen can't be vice president. It's got to be someone like Madeline Byer. So I said, okay. So I was first vice president. So Madeline became first vice president and I became second vice president. And I walked out of there and I thought, I went home and I got my college transcript and I drove over to the university. And in those days I went right to the dean of education, showed him my transcript, told him I wanted to get certified. And that's how come I became a teacher.
What year
Thanks
was
to
this?
Lillian August.
58, I think.
58. Yeah.
And where did you teach then?
Well, and that, by the way, is an interesting story. For the first couple of years, I taught elementary school because I had to come home for lunch every day because my kids were still in elementary school, and you wouldn't have dreamt of letting the kids come home to an empty house.
Wait a second, this is interesting for our children here.
Yeah.
You came home for lunch? Everybody came home for lunch?
Everybody.
They didn't
So
serve lunch in school.
So the buses would take the kids to...
Oh, there were no buses.
No
Our
bus.
kids went to the South Street School. It was right around
You know,
the
there were a
corner.
lot of 9 or 10 elementary schools in
The
Northampton.
local schools.
Yeah.
And-
9 or 10?
Yes, they were all
Oh, sure,
local,
they were all
small
over the
schools.
place.
There was a
They were
small
never bused.
William Street
Our
School,
kids were never bused.
South Street School, Vernon Street School. There was an elementary school in Florence, elementary school in Leeds.
So what is the farthest you had to walk to get to school in terms of time?
Well,
Well, our kids had to walk 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Yeah.
So how long did you have for lunch?
Oh, yeah, about an hour and a half. And in fact, we lived on Columbus Avenue, and my first teaching job was in East Hampton. And I came home for lunch every day. And that's an interesting story. I was the first Jewish teacher in East Hampton. And the first day or two of school, I spoke to the principal and said, I'm going to have to take, for the high holidays, I told him that I was going to have to take a couple of days off. And he said, well, you'll have to apply for an emergency leave. So I wrote a letter to the school committee and said that I was told that I had to apply for an emergency leave, but since this had been on the calendar for over 5,000 years, I didn't quite see how it would qualify as an emergency. And I got a lovely letter of an apology from the East Hampton School Committee. And I got...
Did you keep it?
What?
The letter?
No, I should have. But anyway, and I got my time off for the high holidays.
So you went on to teach at Northampton High School?
And then Marcy was still in elementary school. I taught for 3 years in East Hampton, and then I taught in Leeds for a couple of years until Marcy went to junior high.
But let me interrupt here. Ruth taught in East Hampton for 3 years. She would have preferred Northampton. It's closer. There were no openings, but she kept listening. She kept. She would always wanted to come back to Northampton. That's where we lived. And then either you heard of an opening or somebody asked you to
Kay
apply.
Sheehan told me to apply.
Okay,
yeah.
somebody told her to apply. There was an opening. She applied for the opening, and there was a battle royal at the school committee over her hiring.
I still have that article.
And I'm sure there was some anti-Semitism to it because after bantying around various arguments, one person said, well, you know, her husband already has a job, so it isn't important that we hire her. And then somebody else said, well, we've got to take care of our own. That was at an open school committee meeting.
But I got the job.
But anyway, there was a battle royal, and somebody walked out of the in a huff that night. One of the school committee members. And,
Yeah. I
anyway,
still have the article.
That was like 1960s?
1961, possibly.
The person who walked out was against her or for her?
Against
Against.
her.
And this is a neighbor. So
Well,
to speak.
Northampton person.
A Northampton
right?
person.
Northampton.
And you were running the clothing store still?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So the woman can be home taking care of the children. Why
Right,
should she?
sure.
Right.
That was
Exactly.
the.
Well,
And which job was that in Northampton?
that was at Leeds.
The lead school.
That's elementary.
Uh-huh.
And you taught there for a few years, and then you went to the junior high.
And then I started teaching English. When Marcy went to junior high, then I didn't have to come home for lunch every day.
And ultimately you taught in the high school.
Yeah.
You taught English.
Yeah.
What years was that?
I taught in the high school for 18 years, and I retired 21 years ago.
You retired in 1987, so you taught there for
About
the 18
1970s
years,
to about 87. approximately.
71 or so to.
69, yeah.
Were you conscious of being a Jewish teacher?
Not
At the high
overly.
school?
No.
Do you remember
No,
any
I
other
was-
Jewish teachers while you were there
Yeah,
that you would?
what was her name? She taught German.
She was hardly Jewish, though.
Well, she was Jewish. They lived next to the Sharks on Crescent Street. There were a couple of them. There was somebody else. But I was never uncomfortable about being Jewish at the high school.
Do you think the kids knew that Cohen was a Jewish name?
Oh, I'm sure there were Jewish kids.
Let's go back for a moment. So your wife is a school teacher, and you decide after 18 years in the clothing store. A quick aside.
Yeah.
Where did your father or you buy the clothing? Who were your suppliers of these clothing? Where would you get the clothing?
There were firms all over the country, represented by salesmen from Boston and New York primarily, who sometimes would call on us. More often we would go to their office and showrooms in Boston and New York.
Can you recall some of the names of the suppliers?
Ship and Shore blouses, Judy Bond blouses,
Name brands.
Marie Dressler dresses, and a lot that weren't branded, had no names. Max Wies Undress Company, for example, they'd come in with no label. And
So was one of the things that you did when you got to the store was to put a company store label in?
we didn't. No.
No, you didn't.
No.
What dress shops have sort of different clientele. You could have chic and young, or you could have matronly and steady. Where was Cohen Brothers?
It was kind of matronly.
Uh-huh.
We tried to change that a little bit, I think, but it was for the most part it was matronly and lower end in price.
Uh-huh.
Probably because of the location, I think. I don't think at least at that time anything in the high end could be attracted to that end of the street, but I don't know.
Location.
Who were your competitors in the clothing business in town?
In town was
They were all Jews.
Ann
That's what I'm
August.
asking. Yeah, Ann August.
Probably Ann August, maybe Burgers.
Burgers.
Uh-huh.
And August and Burgers.
And Burgers. And I guess to an extent McCallum's. McCallum's was a competitor of everybody, the big department store.
Why would I go to Ann August rather than you? What did they have that was different? Who were they appealing to?
They had bigger. It was a bigger selection.
Who was appealing to people with money? Women who had money? The Smith girls.
That was George Steinberg.
George Steinberg, the Albert, the store that you called Albert's.
Yeah.
It was
very
higher
upper
priced
end.
and younger. He had a lot of Smith College trade, for example.
And also Green Street.
And Green Street had a number of shops, opposite the college. They're not there anymore, but there was a
Peck and Peck.
There was a Filene's in Northampton, not on Green Street, but right down at the end of Main Street, where right next to the Edwards Church. One of the last stores on the street was found. There was a New York shoe store on Green Street called Frank Brothers, and there was a very exclusive dress shop called Angotti's.
Yeah.
On
Angotti?
Angotti.
Uh-huh.
One word.
One word.
Uh-huh.
And they were all higher priced. They weren't competitors in the sense that nobody would go from our store to theirs.
Right.
Comparison shop.
How was the decision made to close your store?
Our store?
Yeah, how did
that
the
was
family decide?
That was after I got out.
That has nothing to do with
I left the store in 1966 to go back to study math.
Who took over?
My brother and sister, who were my partners then. Anyway, I just backed out. They bought me out, in fact, and my sister stayed on for maybe 5 years.
I don't know.
A few years.
A couple of years.
And then she left, and my brother had it alone for maybe another 5 years.
And then what happened?
Well, he just, I think he originally had hoped that his son, he has two sons.
That's what I'm asking.
And I think that he originally, his sons were still in high school or college. I think he had hoped that his sons would eventually come back one day, and they didn't. They both have good jobs on their own. Have you heard about them? Well, one of them is a reporter.
Give some names.
Okay. My brother Milton had two sons. The older is Richard, who is he went to law school, and he never practiced law, but he's a congressional reporter for the National Journal. Have you ever heard of the National Journal? Very small circulation, about 8 or 10,000, 14,000. No ads. Their distribution is mostly in Washington. 150 copies a month. It goes to the White House. And he's a congressional reporter. He knows He knows most of the representatives. He knows Nancy Pelosi calls him Rich.
Yeah.
Richard Cohen.
He calls her Nancy.
Yeah, and he's a reporter. His brother, his younger brother,
Named?
named Jimmy, was loved sports when he was in high school. He used to write for the Gazette when he was in high school. He'd write the sports write-ups of the Northampton games. When he got to college, he wrote college games, and when he graduated from college, he became a sports editor for the Milwaukee Journal, and then he became a sports editor for the Philadelphia Bulletin.
Philadelphia
Inquirer. Yeah. Philadelphia Inquirer. And after that, he thought that TV was the media of the future, and he left the Inquirer to join ESPN.
Huh.
And he was I don't know his exact title, but he was from everything I've heard, he was very prominent, kind of a big shot at ESPN. And he had that job for 14, 15 years, and just there was a realignment a few years ago. Different people moved in and out, and he felt that his group. Anyway, he quit that job a year or two ago, and he went back. He's now sports editor again at the Philadelphia Inquirer.
That's lovely. So as long as you've given the names of your brother's wife's name?
Charlotte.
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 Charlotte. She was a Springfield girl. Her maiden name was Gelfman. Charlotte Gelfman.
Okay. And your sister?
My sister's name was Beatrice. She was 2.5 years older than I was. And,
is she married?
Yeah.
She well, before she was married, during the war, and when my father got sick, she practically ran the store herself because he wasn't able to. And
she was a graduate of Smith.
She graduated Smith in 1943. And so she was running the store.
Did she marry a local boy?
Married a boy from New York by the name of Murray. His name was Cohentius. And this is a long Portuguese name, I think. Cohencious. Cohentius. And he shortly
sounds like a Cohen to me.
Shortly after they were married, he changed his name to Conrad.
And by the way, could I just interrupt and say that Beatrice's daughter is married to Rick Prowser, Mel Prowser's son.
Uh-huh.
Mel Prowser's oldest.
What is Beatrice's daughter's name?
Her name is Nancy. They live in Seattle.
So Nancy Conrad married
to Rick Prowser.
Rick Prowser, and they live in Seattle.
Yeah.
And the other children?
One other, Laurie. She's married to a doctor. They live in New Jersey.
And what's you don't know the name?
Laurie. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, it'll come to you.
Yeah.
And so that's it. You had two siblings.
3 siblings. I have a third.
Next one.
My third brother's Bernard, a year and a half younger than I am.
Uh-huh.
So my Melton, was
right.
10 years older. He was
right.
a half brother, and then the 3 of us came in quite rapid order. My sister's 2.5 years older than I am, and I'm a year and a half older than Bernard. So
Bernard got married.
Oh yes.
Yeah, Bernard's a year and a half younger than we are. He was married.
He is married.
He went to Yale, and from Yale he taught at Yale after he got finished, and then he went to Princeton with the Woodrow Wilson Institute at Princeton, and from there he went to the University of Wisconsin, where he taught, and he had various administrative jobs.
What
he was the
did
head
he
of the
teach?
graduate school,
Political
science. And he eventually
Chairman
wound
of
up
the
being the chancellor there. He preceded Donna Shalala. Do you remember when Donna Shalala went to the White House? She
Under
went.
Clinton, I think.
She went from Wisconsin, I think.
Right.
And
She went to Hunter after that. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
and she followed Bernard at Madison at Wisconsin.
Bernard is the only one of your siblings who is not in the business.
Yes, yes.
That was obvious from the beginning.
Well, I know he was the youngest, and so when he became of, she has a funny story. But when he became of age, he was freer to be. The store was already taken care of. My sister and Milton and I were the three of us, and Murray for a short while was working in the store too. Bees, Murray Conrad.
Right. This is a store that supported 3 families.
Yes, yeah. So,
And workers too?
and workers, yes, yeah,
That's a good store.
yeah, yeah.
So what are they, so Bernard got married?
Yes, and he got
His
married.
name, her name is?
Her name was Toby Proper, from Philadelphia. Strangely, Ruth, they met unconnected with us. They happened to meet down south. My brother was in the service, and at a USO dance, he met Toby, and they got to talking. Oh, I've got a brother who goes to Penn, and he has a girlfriend in Philadelphia. And anyway, when Toby came back one summer, she got in touch with Ruth, and so
Became
they've
fast
been
friends.
good friends ever since.
What are do they have children?
They have children.
Can you
They
give
have-
us their names?
They have the two daughters. One of them, the older, is Barbie, who is the director of the museum.
No, that's Janie. Janie is the director of the
Oh, I'm
museum.
sorry. Yeah.
they
Is Barbie the older?
Barbie is the older.
Barbie's the
one.
older.
Janie directs the.
Yeah. Okay. Barbie's the older. She's a lawyer in Chicago. No, in
Texas.
Texas.
She's married to an Israeli.
Yeah.
Maybe we
And-
should let Ruth continue. She seems to be
Right.
remembering better here.
And Janie is the. She's the director of the art museum at the University of Vermont in Brattleboro.
In Burlington?
Burlington, I mean.
Yeah.
Burlington.
She's director of the art museum.
Yeah,
Yeah. The Fleming. It's called the Fleming.
yeah. Fleming.
And what is her married name?
Oh, well, Janie is. She's Janie Cohen. She's divorced.
Okay.
Yeah. That's
When
right.
Bernie got his first, he graduated from Yale and he got his first teaching job there. My father-in-law said to him, "Look, if it doesn't work, you can always come back to the store." And I always thought of that when Bernie was chancellor of the University of Wisconsin.
Well, he said it like teaching
Yeah,
is
you know,
that's not much of a job. You can it was.
He never came back in
Let's
other
not
words.
forget, can you briefly tell us about your teaching career? So you got your teaching
Yeah.
degree, and where
No,
did you
no,
want?
we really have 2 other outstanding things. Let's finish with the children.
Okay.
Who wants to say the names of your children?
Oh,
All right. Well, you know Carol, her daughter Carol, and you know what she does. She's the
Well, we do, but
she's the CEO of Loomis Village, Applewood, and Loomis House.
and she's married too,
She's married to Brad Katz,
and they have
and they have 2 children, and
who are named.
Nathan, who's married to Sarah August, Nancy and Bob August's daughter, and they have 2 gorgeous children. We have great-grandchildren.
And what are their names?
Hannah is 2 years old, and Jonah is about 4 weeks old.
just
Yeah,
Oh,
just
That's
born.
And that's Carol is the oldest?
Carol's the oldest.
Okay.
Yeah, and then they have a daughter, Leah, who is she's a ranger at Glacier National Park, among other things.
she's
Also an artist.
she's the one who did this.
Yeah, she's the one who did
Is
that.
she named after Lena, your mother?
Well, yes, she
Yes.
is. Yes.
So your mother's Hebrew name was
Yeah.
probably Leah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
I
in
don't
fact,
know, probably.
Nathan, their son, is named after my Zeta.
Lovely.
We have a daughter, Susan. Susan, she's married to Peter Hellman. Susan's an economist at the City of New York. And they have 2 children, Jacob and Kate. Kate's a senior in college, and Jake graduated from Oberlin a few years ago, and he's working in Philadelphia. And we have a third daughter, Marcy.
The three girls are all 2 years apart.
Marcy isn't married. Marcy is the director of the Center for Foreign Students and Faculty at Rutgers. And she's not married.
And Peter Hellman does what for a living?
Peter Hellman is a freelance writer.
And he's done some books on the Holocaust?
Oh, yeah. As a matter of fact, Jacob, our grandson, on the day Jacob was born, they went through that book, French Children of the Holocaust, and they found a little boy who was born on the same day, and they named him after that little boy. And coincidentally, several years later, the little boy died in the concentration camp, but his sister lived, and they have been in contact with her.
I think the Claresvilles.
Yeah.
The Claresvilles told
Yeah.
this woman of Peter and his son Jacob. And
Peter
they got in
worked
touch
hand in
with
hand
Jacob.
with the Claresvilles. And Peter and Susan together published that book.
So tell us about your grandchildren, right? And their level of observance. And
I don't think the level of observance of our grandchildren is very high, and I think it might be as they mature. I don't know. Ruth and I, when we were first married, we were lukewarm observers, and the older we get, the more comfortable we get with it. I have a feeling that our grandchildren are like that, but I can't swear.
But, I mean, our grandchildren have all been bar and bat mitzvah.
But I don't think, for example, any of them are members of a synagogue. And
Well, just Jake and, Nathan and Sarah are the only ones who are married.
well, they're the only ones who
Yeah.
are married, but
But they live in Epping, New Hampshire, and I don't think there's a synagogue within 50 miles.
probably not. But
What do
They
they
come,
what do they do
come
for a
for the
living?
high holidays.
Nathan is an EMT and
Sarah is
drives an ambulance, and Sarah is a
physician's assistant.
physician's assistant, a PA, a certified physician's assistant.
Okay.
tell us about your teaching career briefly.
Okay, well, I got out of the store in '66, and I studied at Smith and the university for 2 years, including summers, very intensively, kind of making up for the whole 18 years that I was in the store. And I started looking around. I applied several places, and I got a job at the Greenfield Community College, which turned out to be just perfect for me. It was you don't need a PhD, but you need a combination of empathy for students who some of them aren't ideal students. Some were.
You
but
had
it's
some
just,
wonderful students.
We had some wonderful students, but our students weren't a homogeneous group of top learners like Amherst and Harvard gets. We had a smattering of people with abilities all across the board. And I taught all kinds of math, from what a friend of mine called bonehead algebra through pre-calculus and calculus and differential equations and whatever needed to be taught. We had a small department with 3 of us and 4 of us sometimes 3, sometimes 4. And we like to change courses frequently. Instead of teaching this all the time, we try to mix it up so we would all teach all the courses. And I enjoyed it. We had very few Jews as students.
How about as faculty?
Faculty had quite a few Jews, and in fact, when I was hired by a Jew who was the dean of faculty. His name was J. Padgug, Padgug, who at the time was living in Springfield, in Greenfield, since has moved away. And he originally came to GCC as a dean, I think, and moved away after he.
I think the president of GCC is Jewish now, isn't he?
No.
The president was.
Not now.
No, wasn't.
Who else was Jewish teaching there?
At the time,
Oh, Ira
Rubenzahl.
who's now president of STIC.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Was he a local boy?
No, Ira is from New York State, somewhere. Incidentally, I don't know if this is germane to what we're talking about. I was on the search committee that hired Ira, and Ira has a fantastic background. He graduated from Princeton with a top math award, and he got a PhD in particle physics from MIT. And here is this application to teach at Greenfield Community College from a guy who is overqualified. And I asked him during an interview that pointed question. I said, why do you want to teach at community college? And he said, because he said, my only two alternatives would be to continue what I'm doing. And he said, I would know more and more about less and less, and I would eventually be able to communicate with a dozen people around the world. And he said, that's not my interest. My interest is in people politically even. He he said he liked to teach, and he likes to be part of a group. And
He's a great teacher.
And it's exactly what he did. He was a good teacher, and he was a good politician. He became the statewide head of the faculty union. In fact, the faculty is organized in Massachusetts, and he became the statewide head of the faculty union, and eventually the president of STIC.
Are there any words you'd like us to conclude with? Any words for the next generation in terms of advice or the way you've led your life or principles? Anything you'd like that comes to mind?
I can't think of anything that I'd like.
I don't like to give advice. I can only say I feel as if we're two of the luckiest people I know. We had a wonderful life together. We have wonderful, appreciative children and grandchildren. We just had two of our grandchildren grown up who spent a couple of days with us this past week. And it was just a wonderful, enriching experience for us, and I think for them too.
Yeah.
And we just feel very fortunate. And I don't know. I attribute a lot of. I just want to say, when Bob was talking about his mother and father, my mother and father were so in love with each other that. Am I saying the right thing? You've just never seen anything like it. I mean, it was. Oh, in fact, one of our kids said when she was little, she used to think that my mother's their names were Jenny Dearest and Louie Dearest, because that's how they would refer to one another. And I grew up surrounded by so much love, my Zeta and my parents, that I think the example, I think that it's certainly
rubbing off.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
These are Ruth Cohen's parents. On the left is Louis Freed, and on the right is Jenny Myers Freed. Jenny spelled Jennie. And here are Lou and Jenny together in later years, lighting candles.
This is Ruth and me when we were
Right before
engaged.
we were married.
And here are our three children. Here's Carol, Susan, Marcy. And this is an old picture of me when I was about 2 years old.
My granddaughter Leah, when she was about 10, brought a friend of hers to our house and said, "I want to show you a picture of my grandma when she used to be pretty."
This is Robert Cohen. Do you have a Hebrew name?
Ruvain.
Ruvain. And this is their daughters, Carol, Susan on the far right, and Marcy. This is a picture of Susan Cohen Hellman with her husband Peter Hellman and their children
Kate and
Kate
Jake.
and Jake, mentioned earlier Jacob. And this is a picture of Carol Cohen Katz and her husband Brad Katz and their two children
Leah and
Nathan.
and Nathan. This is
Marcy.
the third daughter, Marcy Cohen.